3 hours until my execution. One final request. One loyal dog. And the truth that would destroy everything. Warden Patricia Moss stood at my cell door. "What do you want, Rivera?" "Last meal." "Phone call." "My dog," I said. "I want to see Shadow." She looked surprised. Most men in my position wanted whiskey or ribeye steak, not a German shepherd they hadn't seen in 7 years. But she made it happen. They brought me to a visitation room. Cold, sterile, 7 guards watching my every move. Through the glass, Detective Caldwell stood watching too. The man who'd built the case against me. The man who'd convinced a jury I murdered my fiancée Elena. He'd come to see his victory completed. When Shadow entered, I fell to my knees. He was older, grayer, limping from injuries he'd sustained the night Elena died. But his eyes were the same. Those sharp, intelligent eyes that had always known me better than anyone. I expected him to run to me, to lick my face, to whimper and press his body against mine one last time before they took me away forever. Instead, he stopped, stared, and growled low, dangerous, primal. But not at me. At Detective Caldwell. And suddenly I knew. Shadow hadn't forgotten. He'd never forgotten who really killed Elena that night. Before we begin, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible true stories that will leave you speechless. And truly, I am curious. Where in the world are you watching from? We love to see how far our stories travel. Drop your location in the comments below. Now, let's dive into today's story. Less than 3 hours remained until my execution when Warden Patricia Moss appeared at the door of my cell. She was a silver-haired woman with sharp, calculating eyes and a face carved by 2 decades of witnessing final hours, of presiding over last words and lost appeals. She asked for my final request, and I answered without hesitation that I wanted to see Shadow, my German shepherd, one last time. Moss raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised that I hadn't requested my mother's meatloaf or a call to my sister in Phoenix. "Your dog," she repeated, her voice measured. "Mr. Rivera, most men in your position ask for." "I don't want prime rib or phone calls, Warden," I said quietly, meeting her gaze. "I just want to see my dog one last time before you kill me." Something flickered in her eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or understanding. She nodded slowly. "I'll see what I can do." As her footsteps echoed down the corridor, I lay back on the thin mattress and let the memories wash over me. I could see Elena standing in that cramped pet store on Sunset Boulevard 7 years ago, her dark curls bouncing as she rushed toward a pen full of German Shepherd puppies. "Marcus, look at this one," she'd called out, scooping up a tiny black and rust bundle with oversized paws. The puppy had licked her face with desperate enthusiasm, and Elena had laughed. That bright, unguarded laugh I'd fallen in love with. "He chose me," she'd whispered, pressing her forehead against the puppy's. "Can we keep him? Please." I'd wanted to say we could barely afford our rent, that a dog was a responsibility we weren't ready for. Instead, I'd watched her cradle that puppy against her chest and heard myself say, "What should we name him?" She'd looked at the dog, then at me, her eyes shining. "Shadow. Because he'll always be with us, like our shadow." I remembered proposing to her 6 months later in that same tiny apartment, both of us sitting on our second-hand couch with Shadow sprawled across our laps. I'd hidden the ring, a modest diamond I'd saved for over a year to buy, under Shadow's collar. When Elena found it, she'd started crying, and Shadow had licked the tears from her cheeks, confused but devoted. "Is that a yes?" I'd asked, my voice breaking. She'd kissed me, then kissed the dog, then kissed me again. "It's a yes to both of you." Our life had been simple but full of love. Morning coffees on the fire escape. Shadow sleeping between us every night. Elena reading case files for work while I studied for my lieutenant's exam. Weekend hikes where Shadow would race ahead, then circle back to make sure we were following. Nothing extraordinary. Nothing remarkable. Just us. 7 years I'd sat in this cell, telling anyone who would listen that I didn't kill her. 7 years of appeals and hearings and lawyers who looked at me with barely concealed doubt. 7 years of maintaining my innocence while the world decided I was a monster. Moss returned 40 minutes later, her expression carefully neutral. "I found him," she said. "Your dog's been at a shelter in Lancaster. They're bringing him now." She paused, studying my face. "It'll take about 90 minutes. We'll arrange the visit in a secure room." "Thank you, Warden," I managed, my throat tight. She turned to leave, then stopped. "Mr. Rivera?" "For what it's worth," she hesitated. "I've seen a lot of guilty men in my career. Most of them don't ask to see their dogs." After she left, I closed my eyes and thought of Shadow. Wondered if he'd remember me. Wondered if 7 years had erased the bond we'd shared. Wondered if he blamed me, somehow, for Elena's death the way everyone else did. I had 90 minutes left to find out. The night Elena died started like any other 48-hour shift at Fire Station 19. We'd responded to 6 calls in 2 days: a car accident on the 101, a kitchen fire in Koreatown, an elderly woman with chest pains who held my hand the entire ambulance ride. But the last call, the one that kept me 3 hours past shift change, was a house fire in Silver Lake with a family of 4 trapped on the 2nd floor. I'd gone in with Captain Torres while the structure groaned and cracked around us. We found them huddled in a bathroom, smoke inhalation already turning their lips blue. I'd carried the youngest, a girl maybe 5 years old, down a ladder while flames licked at my turnout gear. When I handed her to the paramedics and watched her cough and cry and breathe, I felt that familiar surge of purpose. This was why I did it. This was what mattered. By the time I peeled off my gear and drove home, it was nearly 11 p.m. My body ached, my lungs burned from smoke, but all I could think about was crawling into bed next to Elena, feeling her curl against me the way she always did, Shadow's warm weight at our feet. The apartment door was ajar. Not wide open, just slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness visible where it should have been closed and locked. My exhaustion evaporated instantly, replaced by cold dread. Elena never left the door open. Never. I pushed it wider, calling her name, reaching for the light switch. The living room was undisturbed. Her case files were still spread across the coffee table. Shadow's water bowl sat in its usual spot by the kitchen entrance. Everything looked normal except for the terrible, heavy silence. Then I saw her. Elena lay on the kitchen floor in a spreading pool of blood, her white blouse soaked crimson, her eyes open and staring at nothing. Multiple stab wounds across her chest and abdomen. A kitchen knife lay beside her body, its blade red and gleaming under the fluorescent light. I don't remember crossing the room. I don't remember dropping to my knees. I only remember pulling her into my lap, pressing my hands against the wounds, feeling her blood, so much blood, warm and slick between my fingers. I held her and screamed her name until my voice gave out, trying to press her wounds closed with my hands, but her eyes were already empty. Elena was already gone. I called 911 with shaking, blood-covered hands. The operator's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Sir, is she breathing? Sir, can you check for a pulse?" But I already knew. I'd seen enough death in my career to recognize it. I just couldn't accept it. The police arrived within minutes, flashlights cutting through the darkness, voices sharp and commanding. "Step away from her. Sir, step back now." But I couldn't let go. I couldn't stop trying to save her, even though I knew. God, I knew. It was too late. They pulled me away from her body, and only then did I notice Shadow was gone. His collar hung on its hook by the door, but the dog himself had vanished. No barking, no scratching, no sign of him anywhere. Detective James Caldwell arrived 20 minutes later, a tall man in his 40s with graying temples and sharp, intelligent eyes. He surveyed the scene with the careful attention of someone who'd worked hundreds of homicides. When he spoke to me, his voice was measured but not unkind. "Mr. Rivera, I'm Detective Caldwell. I know this is difficult, but I need to ask you some questions." I sat on my own couch, wrapped in a blanket someone had draped over my shoulders, Elena's blood drying on my hands and clothes. Caldwell asked about our relationship, about money problems, about an argument neighbors had reported hearing last week. His questions felt pointed, deliberate, but at the time I thought he was just being thorough. "We'll find who did this," Caldwell promised, his hand briefly touching my shoulder. "I give you my word. Justice will be served." I believed him. God help me, I actually believed him. Animal Control found Shadow 3 days after Elena's murder, limping through Elysian Park with a deep gash on his right hind leg. The dog was covered in dried blood, his coat matted and filthy, and clenched between his teeth were shreds of dark fabric. Expensive fabric, the forensic report would later note, possibly from a suit jacket. I was already in custody by then, sitting in a holding cell, desperately trying to understand how my life had become a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. The prosecution built their case with surgical precision. Deputy District Attorney Sarah Chen stood before the jury and laid out a story so convincing, so airtight, that even I almost believed it. Marcus Rivera, stressed about money, working exhausting shifts, arguing with his fiancée about their financial situation. A fight that escalated. A moment of rage. A kitchen knife. And afterward, a panicked attempt to stage the scene, to make it look like something else. The evidence was damning. My fingerprints were the only ones on the murder weapon because I'd pulled it from Elena's body in my desperation to help her. My clothes were soaked with her blood because I'd held her, tried to save her, refused to accept she was gone. Our neighbor, Mrs. Chen from 3B, testified that she'd heard us arguing the week before, which was true. We'd been stressed about credit card debt and whether we could afford a bigger apartment. I had no alibi for the estimated time of death because I'd stayed late at the station alone, finishing paperwork after my crew went home. And then there was Shadow. The prosecution's theory was devastating in its simplicity. The dog had witnessed me kill Elena and fled in terror. The blood on his coat was Elena's blood. The fabric in his teeth was from my work clothes that I'd stripped off and thrown in the corner. His injuries came from me trying to silence him, to eliminate the only witness. The defendant's own dog ran away from him, Chin told the jury, her voice heavy with meaning. Even the animal knew what he'd done. My public defender, an overworked woman named Jennifer Martinez who was juggling 40 cases at once, tried to poke holes in their narrative. She couldn't explain Shadow's injuries adequately. She couldn't provide a compelling alternative theory. She was fighting an uphill battle against a mountain of circumstantial evidence that all pointed in one direction. Detective Caldwell took the stand on day 4 of the trial. He sat in the witness box with calm authority, walking the jury through his investigation with meticulous detail. He'd documented everything. My contamination of the crime scene when I'd cleaned some of Elena's blood from the floor in my panic, thinking somehow I was helping preserve her dignity. He'd tracked Elena's missing jewelry, her silver locket, her engagement ring, her grandmother's bracelet, and suggested I'd sold them to make the murder look like a robbery. In my 20 years as a homicide detective, Caldwell testified, his voice measured and certain, I've seen many domestic violence cases that escalate to murder. The evidence in this case is consistent with a spontaneous act of rage followed by an attempt to cover up the crime. I watched him from the defense table, this man who'd promised me justice, who'd seemed so sympathetic that terrible night. He sat behind the prosecutor's table every single day of my trial, present for every witness, every piece of evidence. Even in the summer heat, even when everyone else wore short sleeves, Caldwell always wore long-sleeved dress shirts, his right arm always covered. At the time, I thought nothing of it. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned, not one of them would meet my eyes. The forewoman stood and read the verdict in a voice that seemed to echo from the depths of hell. We, the jury, find the defendant, Marcus Rivera, guilty of murder in the first degree. The jury looked at me like I was a monster. And maybe I was, not because I killed her, but because I couldn't save her. The judge sentenced me to death 3 weeks later. Shadow was sent to a shelter where he became aggressive and unpredictable, damaged by the trauma of that night. No one wanted to adopt a dog that growled at strangers and had violent outbursts. 7 years later, we were both still prisoners of a crime I didn't commit. 90 minutes later, I was escorted into a stark visitation room with pale aqua walls and barred windows that let in cold afternoon light. The temperature was barely above freezing, and I could feel the chill through my thin gray prison shirt as 7 corrections officers lined the walls like sentinels. Warden Moss had made good on her promise. Shadow was being transported from a shelter in Lancaster, a 2-hour drive that had been cut to 90 minutes with emergency authorization and a state trooper escort. Through the reinforced observation glass, I could see Detective James Caldwell standing in the corridor, arms crossed over his expensive charcoal suit. Even from this distance, I recognized the man who had built the case against me 7 years earlier, who had testified in court with such unwavering certainty, as if he'd witnessed Elena's murder with his own eyes. His presence here on the day of my execution didn't surprise me. He'd attended every parole hearing, every appeal, ensuring that justice, as he understood it, would be served. He wanted to watch me die. He wanted to see his victory completed. Warden Moss stood near the door, her expression carefully neutral but her eyes sharp, missing nothing. The guards shifted their weight, hands resting near their belts, ready for anything. I was considered a violent offender after all. A man who'd stabbed his fiancée to death in their own kitchen. They weren't taking chances. The heavy steel door scraped open, and I heard the click of claws on linoleum before I saw him. A young guard named Torres led Shadow into the room on a short leather leash, and my breath caught in my throat. My dog had aged dramatically over 7 years. His once glossy coat of black and rust was now patchy and dull, his muzzle thick with gray fur, and his gait revealed a pronounced limp in his right hind leg, a permanent scar from that terrible night. But his eyes, those deep amber eyes that had watched me propose to Elena in our cramped apartment kitchen, remained sharp and aware. I dropped to my knees on the cold concrete floor, my cuffed hands held out as far as the chains would allow, tears already blurring my vision. "Shadow," I whispered, my voice breaking. "Shadow, boy. It's me. I'm here." This was our goodbye. Our final moment before the state of California ended my life for a crime I swore to God I didn't commit. 7 years we'd been separated. 7 years since that night when Elena died and Shadow disappeared into the darkness, wounded and traumatized. 7 years since I'd been able to touch him, to feel his warm fur under my hands, to hear his breathing beside me at night. "Shadow, boy. I'm so sorry," I said, the words tumbling out through my tears. "I'm so sorry I couldn't protect her. I'm so sorry for everything." I expected him to rush toward me the way he used to when I came home from double shifts at the fire station, his whole body wiggling with joy, his tail wagging so hard it would knock over the lamp on the side table. I expected him to lick my face, to press his body against mine, to whimper with recognition and happiness. I expected one last moment of pure love before they took me away forever. But Shadow didn't move toward me. He stopped exactly 3 meters away from where I knelt, his entire body going rigid as stone. His ears pricked forward, alert and focused. The fur along his spine slowly began to rise, bristling with tension. And then, from deep in his chest, came a sound that froze everyone in the room, a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the concrete floor itself. It was a sound I'd only heard him make twice in his entire life. Once when a drunk man had tried to force his way into our apartment building at 2 in the morning. And once when Elena and I had encountered a rattlesnake on a hiking trail in Griffith Park. It was the sound Shadow made when he sensed genuine danger, when he recognized a threat. But he wasn't growling at me. His laser-focused gaze was locked on the observation window, on the man standing behind the glass with his arms crossed and his expression confident. Shadow was growling at Detective James Caldwell. The sound cut through the room like a knife. Shadow's growl deepened, becoming something primal and dangerous, a warning that made every nerve in my body stand on edge. The guards tensed immediately, hands moving toward their belts where pepper spray and batons hung ready. Torres, the young guard holding Shadow's leash, took a step back, his face pale. "Easy," Torres said nervously, tightening his grip on the leather. "Easy, boy." But Shadow wasn't listening. His entire body had gone rigid, muscles coiled tight beneath his patchy coat. The fur along his spine stood straight up, creating a raised ridge from his shoulders to his tail. His lips pulled back, revealing teeth that were still sharp despite his age. This wasn't the confused reaction of a traumatized animal. This was focused, deliberate aggression. I knelt there on the cold floor, my arms still outstretched, confusion and hurt washing over me in waves. "Shadow," I whispered, my voice cracking. "Boy, it's me. Don't you remember me?" For a terrible moment, I thought maybe the prosecution had been right all along. Maybe Shadow did blame me for Elena's death. Maybe in his animal mind, he associated me with that horrible night, with blood and violence and loss. Maybe I'd lost him too, along with everything else. Then I realized something that made my blood run cold. Shadow wasn't looking at me at all. His gaze was locked, absolutely fixed on something behind me. On someone behind me. I turned slowly, following the line of his stare. Through the reinforced observation glass, Detective James Caldwell stood watching, but his posture had changed. His arms were crossed tightly over his chest now, defensive rather than confident. Even from this distance, I could see a thin sheen of sweat on his forehead. His jaw was clenched. Caldwell's voice crackled through the intercom speaker. Too loud, too quick. The dog's probably traumatized, unpredictable after all these years in a shelter. This was a mistake, Warden. We should end this before someone gets hurt. But Warden Moss didn't move. Her sharp eyes flicked from Shadow to Caldwell and back again, her expression thoughtful. She'd spent 20 years reading people, watching behavior, spotting things that didn't add up. And something here wasn't adding up. Actually, came a different voice. Sam Rodriguez, the senior corrections officer who'd always treated me with quiet compassion over the years, who'd slipped me extra library time and never spoken to me like I was a monster. Sam was in his 50s, a veteran of the system, and his voice carried weight. "I'd like to see something. Let's bring the dog closer to the observation window." "That's not necessary," Caldwell started, but Moss cut him off with a raised hand. "Do it," she said. Torres hesitated, then began walking Shadow toward the glass. The closer they got to Caldwell, the more intense Shadow's reaction became. The low growl turned into sharp, explosive barks that echoed off the concrete walls. Shadow lunged forward, straining against the leash with such force that Torres had to brace himself. The dog's claws scraped frantically at the floor, at the barrier, desperate to get through the glass. Through the window, I watched Caldwell take an involuntary step backward. His hand shot up reflexively, gripping his right forearm through his suit jacket, holding it as if protecting an old injury. His face had gone pale and his eyes, for just a moment, showed something I'd never seen there before. Fear. Memory stirred in my mind like sediment disturbed at the bottom of a dark pool. Shadow coming home 3 days after Elena's murder, limping and covered in blood, with fabric clenched in his teeth. Fabric the forensic report had noted was expensive, possibly from a suit. Shadow's injuries that had never been explained. And Caldwell always wearing long sleeves, even in the scorching summer heat of the courtroom. That growl, I'd only heard Shadow make that sound twice before, and both times it meant real danger. He wasn't confused. He wasn't traumatized. He was warning us. Shadow remembered. After 7 years, my dog remembered exactly who had hurt him that night. And it wasn't me. "Warden," I said, my voice steady for the first time in years, my eyes locked on Caldwell's white face behind the glass. "I think we need to ask the detective a question." A dramatic prison courtyard confrontation under a cold, bright afternoon sun. At the center, a sharply dressed detective stands restrained by 2 uniformed correctional officers, his confident posture shattered, fear and fury etched across his pale face. A prison medical officer carefully rolls up his right sleeve, revealing a grotesque, aged scar running from wrist to elbow, thick, raised, and unmistakably patterned with deep puncture wounds from a large dog bite. Nearby, a chained inmate in a gray prison uniform stands tall despite his restraints, eyes burning with vindication and restrained rage, chains hanging from his wrists as they catch the light. Behind him, a stern female warden watches with commanding authority, phone still in hand, her expression cold and resolute. A senior corrections officer stands slightly apart, arms crossed, face heavy with grim confirmation, while other guards form a tense perimeter. Concrete walls, razor wire fencing, and watchtowers frame the scene. Long shadows stretch across the yard, emphasizing the gravity of the revelation. Ultra-realistic, cinematic lighting, sharp detail, shallow depth of field, dramatic realism, muted institutional colors, emotional intensity, 35mm film look, moment of truth, justice revealed. Warden Moss was already on her phone, her voice crisp and commanding. "This is Warden Patricia Moss at Ironwood State Prison. I need medical records for Detective James Caldwell for the past 10 years, expedited under emergency authority. Subpoena them from every hospital within a 100-mile radius if necessary." She ended the call and looked at Caldwell. We wait. The next 12 minutes were excruciating. Caldwell stood frozen in the courtyard, his exposed arm hanging at his side, his face drained of all color. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cold air. Shadow was held by 3 guards now, but my dog never took his eyes off the detective, never stopped that low, continuous growl that sounded like distant thunder. I couldn't breathe. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst through my chest. 7 years of helplessness, of screaming my innocence to deaf ears, of watching the system crush me beneath its weight. All of it hung in the balance of one phone call. Moss's phone rang. She answered, put it on speaker, and held it up so everyone could hear. "Warden Moss, this is Linda Chen from St. Vincent Medical Center Records Department." The woman's voice was crisp and professional. "I have Detective James Caldwell's file from 7 years ago. Date of admission, April 15th, 3 days after the Elena Torres homicide. 3 days after Elena died. Diagnosis: multiple deep lacerations to the right forearm. Injury pattern consistent with large canine attack. The wounds required 47 stitches and extensive antibiotics. Patient refused tetanus shot. Patient explicitly refused to file a police report for animal attack." There was a pause. The attending physician noted in his records that the patient was evasive about circumstances of injury. Silence fell over the courtyard like a heavy blanket. Even the wind seemed to stop. I found my voice, and it came out steady and clear. "Detective Caldwell, if it was just a random stray dog that bit you, why didn't you file a police report? Why did you lie about a motorcycle accident? Why were you evasive with the doctor about how it happened?" Caldwell said nothing. He stared at the ground, his jaw clenched. I took a step toward him, my chains rattling. Because it wasn't a random dog. Because you killed her. Because Shadow attacked you that night when you murdered Elena in our kitchen. And you've spent 7 years making sure I'd die for your crime. The truth hung in the air between us, undeniable and devastating. Finally, after 7 years, someone besides me knew I was innocent. Caldwell tried to speak, his mouth working soundlessly, but at that moment Shadow lunged forward again with such force that all 3 guards struggled to hold him. This time, though, the dog wasn't lunging toward Caldwell. Shadow's attention had shifted to the observation window, to the corridor beyond it, where through the glass I could see Caldwell's black Mercedes sedan parked in the prison loading zone. Shadow was pulling toward that car with desperate, frantic energy, barking in sharp, insistent bursts, the way he used to bark when he'd found something important on our camping trips, a lost hiker's backpack, an injured animal that needed help. The way a trained search and rescue dog barks when he's found his target. There's something in that car. I shouted, my pulse racing. Shadow's found something. Check the car. Caldwell's face went from pale to gray. He bolted toward the door, shouting, "That's private property. You have no authority." But Warden Moss was already moving, faster than I'd ever seen her move, unclipping her service weapon from her belt. "Detective Caldwell, in this facility, I am the highest authority. You can open that vehicle voluntarily, or I will have it opened by force. Choose now." Sam Rodriguez and 2 other guards flanked Caldwell, blocking his path to the exit. The detective's hands were visibly trembling as he reached into his pocket and pulled out his key fob. We all moved as a group into the corridor, Shadow straining at his leash, pulling toward the Mercedes with single-minded determination. Caldwell pressed the button, and the trunk lid rose with a soft hydraulic hiss. Inside were 2 expensive leather suitcases and a large duffel bag, all packed full, tags attached with destinations. London Heathrow, then connecting flights to Barcelona. One of the guards, a woman named Officer Chen, said quietly, "Detective, are you going somewhere? Isn't it unusual to bring your vacation luggage to witness an execution?" Caldwell's voice was tight, strangled. "I planned to leave directly from here. I have a flight tonight. These are just clothes and personal items." But Shadow wouldn't stop. He leaped up, his front paws on the bumper, his nose working frantically over the suitcases, sniffing with feverish intensity. Then, with a sudden lunge, he clamped his jaws around the side pocket of the largest suitcase and began tearing at the leather with a violence that made the guards step back. Caldwell lunged forward, his composure finally shattering completely. "Get that animal away from my property. This is illegal search and seizure." But Sam Rodriguez and Officer Chen grabbed him by both arms, holding him in place while Shadow ripped the pocket open. Something small and metallic flew from the torn leather, spinning through the air and clattering onto the concrete floor at Warden Moss's feet. She bent down and picked it up carefully, holding it in her palm where we could all see it, a delicate silver locket on a thin chain, slightly tarnished with age but still beautiful, the kind of antique jewelry you find in estate sales. Moss opened the clasp with her thumb, and the locket split open to reveal a tiny photograph inside, faded but still clear, a young woman with dark curly hair and a bright smile, her head tilted slightly, laughing at something off camera. I knew that photograph. I had taken it myself on our honeymoon in Santa Barbara. And I knew that locket because I had given it to Elena for our 3rd wedding anniversary, had watched her face light up when she opened the small velvet box, had clasped it around her neck while she stood in front of the bathroom mirror smiling at our reflection. That locket had disappeared the night Elena was murdered. Detective James Caldwell himself had testified in court about those missing items, had showed the jury photographs of Elena wearing the locket just days before her death, had suggested I'd probably sold it for drug money or thrown it away to support my cover story. Warden Moss turned slowly to face Caldwell, holding the locket up where the afternoon sunlight streaming through the prison windows made it gleam. Her voice was cold as winter. "Detective, you personally testified at trial that the missing jewelry was likely pawned by Rivera to make the murder look like a robbery. You filed reports documenting your search for these items in local pawn shops. Can you explain how the victim's personal locket, the one you claimed was sold or disposed of 7 years ago, ended up in your packed luggage on the day of the convicted man's execution? Why did you keep it? And why are you trying to take it out of the country today?" I watched James Caldwell break apart like a dam giving way under too much pressure. His shoulders slumped, his arms went limp in the guard's grip, and when he lifted his head, all the confidence and authority had drained from his face. He looked at me, and I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen there before. Not triumph or righteousness, but a strange mixture of hatred, exhaustion, and what almost looked like relief, as if he was tired of carrying a crushing weight for 7 long years. When he spoke, his voice started quiet but quickly built to a shout. "She didn't deserve someone like you. Elena was brilliant, beautiful. She could have had anyone. I loved her from the moment we met at UCLA. I offered her everything. My family's money, my connections, a life of comfort. And she chose you, a firefighter who worked 60-hour weeks for a middle-class salary, who came home smelling like smoke. She laughed at me when I told her how I felt. She said I disgusted her, said she could never see me as anything but a colleague." He stopped, breathing hard, and I realized with growing horror that I'd never known any of this. Elena had never mentioned that Caldwell had feelings for her. She worked as a victim's advocate with the district attorney's office. That's how she knew him, how he knew our address, our schedules. The detective's voice dropped lower now, almost as if he was talking to himself. "I went to your apartment that night when I knew you'd be at the station. I'd watched your patterns for weeks. I just wanted to talk to her one more time, to make her understand that we belonged together. But she refused to even let me inside. She told me I was delusional, that she'd report me to HR if I didn't leave her alone. And something just snapped. I don't even remember grabbing the knife from the kitchen counter. I just remember her screaming, trying to run, and the knife in my hand, and the blood." His voice cracked. "And then that goddamn dog came out of nowhere, launched himself at me, sank his teeth into my arm like a wild animal. I thought he was going to kill me. I grabbed a frying pan off the stove and hit him as hard as I could, heard something crack, thought I'd killed him. But he ran, squeezed through the window she'd left open for air, and I was sure he'd die in the park from his injuries. I staged the scene to look like you'd done it in a rage. It was almost too easy. You'd argued about money the week before. The neighbors had heard. Your fingerprints were already all over the apartment. And you had no alibi for those 2 critical hours. I took the locket because—" He closed his eyes. "Because I wanted something of hers. Something to remember that she'd existed, that she'd been real and perfect and mine, even if only in my mind." 2 guards moved forward with handcuffs. Warden Moss was already on her phone with what sounded like the state attorney general's office, her voice crisp and urgent as she demanded immediate intervention, an emergency stay of execution, a full review of my case and Caldwell's involvement in every aspect of the investigation. Everything was happening so fast that it felt surreal, like one of the fever dreams I'd had countless times in my cell where I was exonerated and released, only to wake up in the same 6-by-8-foot concrete box. But this time I didn't wake up. This time, Officer Sam Rodriguez walked over to me and quietly removed my handcuffs, his eyes wet, his voice rough when he said, "Mr. Rivera, I'm so sorry. For all of it." 4 hours later, I stood at the main gates of Ironwood State Prison as a free man. An emergency order from a circuit judge, based on Caldwell's confession and the physical evidence that corroborated Shadow's attack, had vacated my conviction and death sentence with full exoneration. Warden Moss personally walked me to the exit, her hand on my shoulder, and she said something about compensation, about lawsuits, about making sure I was taken care of. But I barely heard her. All I could focus on was the heavy steel gates rolling open in front of me, the late afternoon sunlight spilling through, warm and golden, the sounds of traffic and birds and normal life flowing in from the outside world. I took my first step as a free man in 7 years, feeling the sun on my face, the breeze on my skin, the solid ground beneath my feet. Shadow walked beside me, his limp pronounced but his head held high, and for a moment we just stood there on the sidewalk outside the prison, 2 survivors, breathing free air together. Sam Rodriguez had called a taxi for us, refusing to let me pay, pressing $40 into my hand for whatever you need. I gave the driver an address I'd memorized 7 years ago but never thought I'd visit again. Riverside Cemetery on the east side of the city. The drive took 30 minutes through late afternoon traffic, past neighborhoods I recognized and ones that had changed completely, past the fire station where I used to work, Station 19, where my crew had testified at my trial with tears in their eyes, swearing I wasn't capable of murder. We pulled through the cemetery gates as the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. I walked slowly between the rows of headstones, Shadow beside me, until I found the simple gray granite marker. Elena Maria Torres, beloved wife and daughter, 1989 to 2018, forever in our hearts. I knelt in the grass in front of her grave and placed the bouquet of white roses the taxi driver had helped me buy at a corner store. My voice was rough when I finally spoke. We won, Elena. It took 7 years, but we won. Shadow found your killer. He never forgot what happened that night, never stopped protecting you even after you were gone. I reached out and traced her name carved into the stone with my fingertip. I'm sorry I couldn't save you. I'm sorry it took so long. But James Caldwell will never hurt anyone else. And everyone knows the truth now. Everyone knows you didn't choose wrong when you chose me. Shadow lay down next to me on the damp grass, his gray muzzle resting on my knee, and we sat there in silence as the sun disappeared below the horizon and the first stars began to appear overhead. A cool evening breeze rustled through the oak trees that surrounded the cemetery, carrying the scent of jasmine from somewhere nearby. I didn't feel cold. For the first time in 7 years, I didn't feel the crushing weight of injustice and helplessness. I was free. I was vindicated. And my most loyal friend, who had suffered his own wounds and trauma, who had been separated from me and placed in a shelter where nobody understood why he'd become aggressive and difficult, sat beside me, finally at peace. Loyalty, I realized in that quiet cemetery with my hand resting on Shadow's warm fur, isn't measured in years or miles. True loyalty lives in the heart, in the bone and marrow, in instincts that remember scents and faces and truth even when the whole world has moved on. Loyalty doesn't give up when the odds are impossible. It doesn't stop believing when everyone else has stopped listening. And sometimes, when human justice fails, when courts and lawyers and evidence get twisted into lies, loyalty is the only thing strong enough to set the record straight. Today, the unwavering devotion of an old dog with a gray muzzle and a permanent limp saved my life and finally brought justice for the woman we both loved more than anything in this world. Justice doesn't always come from a courtroom or a judge's gavel. Sometimes it comes from a faithful heart that remembers the truth, no matter how long it takes, no matter how much time has passed. Sometimes justice has 4 legs and amber eyes and refuses to forget.